In a turbulent region already teetering on the edge of conflict and transformation, one voice has pierced through the noise and shaken both allies and adversaries. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader of Burkina Faso, delivered a speech that has now been called catastrophic, not because of confusion or miscalculation, but because of its explosive impact on global and regional powers. Traoré, known for his bold, anti-imperialist rhetoric and commitment to reclaiming Burkina Faso's sovereignty, did not mince his words. In his speech, he made clear that Burkina Faso would no longer tolerate foreign meddling in its internal affairs. He openly criticized the presence of foreign troops and advisors on Burkinabe soil, accusing them of fueling instability rather than aiding in the fight against terrorism. His voice was firm, his tone defiant. He accused certain Western nations of hypocrisy, condemning terrorism while secretly negotiating with armed groups, exploiting resources, and manipulating political systems in West Africa. Our gold, our land, and our people have been exploited for decades, he said. But that era is over. What followed was a direct challenge to the status quo. Traoré announced new security pacts with countries outside of traditional Western alliances, deepening ties with nations like Russia and others that support a multipolar world order. He condemned what he called neo-colonial puppeteering by international institutions and foreign embassies, blaming them for prolonging Burkina Faso's suffering through debt, conditional aid, and covert operations. These remarks did not sit well with Western capitals. The reaction was swift. Media outlets began portraying Traoré as erratic, dangerous, even dictatorial. International organizations issued veiled warnings about democracy and human rights, and behind the scenes, there were reports of diplomatic pressure and even covert destabilization attempts. But inside Burkina Faso, the reaction was entirely different. For many Burkinabe citizens, Traoré's speech was electrifying. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou and beyond, waving national flags, chanting his name, and expressing support for what they saw as the reclaiming of national dignity. Social media exploded with clips of his most powerful quotes, especially the one where he declared, "If dying is the price of freedom, then we are ready to pay." This wasn't just a political statement. It was a rallying cry for a generation tired of external dependency and internal corruption. Traoré positioned himself not just as a soldier, but as a symbol of resistance, drawing on the revolutionary legacy of Thomas Sankara, another Burkinabe leader who once challenged global systems and paid with his life. What makes this speech so dangerous to Burkina Faso's so-called enemies is not only what was said, but how it was received. It exposed a deep undercurrent of anti-colonial sentiment across Africa, where populations are increasingly questioning the intentions of foreign military interventions, multinational corporations, and international donors. Moreover, the timing couldn't have been more critical. As other Sahel nations like Mali and Niger shift toward military-led governments and seek alternatives to Western partnerships, Traoré's message has only amplified a growing regional movement. Together, these leaders are beginning to form a bloc, militarily, economically, and ideologically, that resists Western dominance and seeks African-led solutions to African problems. Critics argue that this approach risks further isolation, sanctions, or internal instability. But supporters counter that decades of alignment with the West have yielded little progress in defeating terrorism or achieving economic justice. For them, Traoré's words mark a necessary rupture with a failed system. In the aftermath of the speech, rumors circulated about attempted coups, foreign intelligence operations, and even assassination plots. The environment became tense. Government, loyalists increased security, and the military was put on high alert. The enemies Traoré referred to, those who benefit from Burkina Faso's chaos, were clearly rattled. And perhaps that was the point. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's speech may have been catastrophic for foreign powers with vested interests in maintaining control over Burkina Faso's political and economic destiny, but for millions of Burkinabe, it was a speech of clarity, courage, and conviction. One that defined a new chapter in the country's fight for true sovereignty. Only time will tell whether this path will lead to greater independence or deeper confrontation. But one thing is certain. Captain Traoré has drawn a line in the sand, and the world is watching closely. While the echoes of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's fiery speech still reverberate across the region, another story began to unfold, one that reveals the deepening cracks in the international order and the growing solidarity among nations challenging Western dominance. Just days after the controversial address, Burkina Faso hosted an unexpected high-level delegation from Mali and Niger. Behind closed doors, these leaders met in Ouagadougou, not as individual heads of state, but as allies crafting a new vision for West Africa. The result? The formalization of the Alliance of Sahel states into more than just a military pact. It began transforming into a potential political and economic union. In a symbolic gesture, the three flags of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were raised side by side at a public square in Ouagadougou. Crowds once again gathered, not out of fear, but hope. This was not just political theater. It was a message to the world. The Sahel is done being dictated to. Captain Traoré took to the podium again, but this time with his counterparts. They announced a series of sweeping initiatives, plans to create a joint military command, the blueprint for a shared currency, and a bold idea, to withdraw collectively from the ECOWAS bloc if sanctions and pressure continued against their governments. This declaration stunned regional observers, but it was what came next that truly shook foreign powers. Traoré revealed that several European diplomats had attempted to secretly persuade Burkina Faso to abandon the alliance. He claimed offers of financial aid, debt relief, and military support were made, on one condition: dissolve ties with Mali and Niger and rejoin the Western security architecture. He rejected them outright. The dignity of our nations, he said, cannot be bought. The blood we shed to defend our people is not for sale. The fallout was immediate. Foreign embassies began scaling back staff. International NGOs reported sudden restrictions and delays, and reports surfaced of disinformation campaigns targeting Traoré's leadership, painting him as a dictator clinging to power. Yet for many Burkinabe citizens of the Sahel, the real narrative was unfolding on the ground. Communities that had long suffered under the threat of terrorism were reporting a growing sense of safety and self-determination, thanks to joint military operations launched under the new alliance. Meanwhile, across Africa, young people began sharing clips of Traoré's speech and the images of the three leaders standing united. They saw in it a possibility, an Africa that could speak for itself, defend itself, and trade on its own terms. But the challenges are immense. International sanctions loom. Access to key markets is restricted. Aid pipelines are slowing. And the threat of economic sabotage, political isolation, or even regime change efforts cannot be ruled out. Still, Traoré and his allies are pressing forward. Their message is clear. The enemies of Burkina Faso are not just terrorists hiding in the bush. They are also the suits in conference rooms, the voices behind foreign news anchors, and the unseen hands in financial systems that keep African nations in perpetual dependence. This second chapter of Traoré's rise is not just about Burkina Faso anymore. It is about a regional realignment, one that is now inspiring movements across the continent, from Guinea to the Democratic Republic of Congo, even as far as Central Africa. For those accustomed to Africa bowing in submission, this is indeed catastrophic. But for the sons and daughters of the soil, it may be the beginning of something long overdue. African nations rising, not in rebellion, but in rightful reclamation of their future. As the geopolitical tremors from Burkina Faso's defiant posture continued to ripple through the continent, yet another chapter began to unfold, this time in the rural heartlands of the country, where an extraordinary movement was gaining ground. Began not in parliament or military headquarters, but in the fields, villages, and town halls of ordinary Burkinabe citizens. Inspired by Captain Ibrahim Traoré's speeches, and the formation of the Sahel Alliance, communities across the country launched what they called the People's Sovereignty Initiative, a grassroots revolution focused on rebuilding the nation from within. This wasn't driven by slogans or political campaigns. It was driven by survival. Villagers started organizing their own local security units, forming civilian militias in coordination with the military to defend themselves against terrorist incursions. Farmers abandoned reliance on foreign aid seeds and fertilizers and turned to indigenous agricultural techniques. Teachers in remote areas began informal literacy programs when foreign-backed education NGOs pulled out. The government, under Traoré's leadership, recognized this momentum. Instead of pushing top-down reforms, they supported the movement from below, redistributing unused state land to farming cooperatives, funding community defense programs, and cutting bureaucratic red tape for local development initiatives. But what made this movement remarkable was its self-reliance. In a small village near Kaya, an elder stood before a gathering and said, "For too long we waited for someone to save us from France, from America, from the UN. But we've realized the only ones coming to save us are us." This spirit began spreading. Medical students started free rural clinics. Engineers volunteered to rebuild damaged roads. In the absence of international donors, local councils organized fundraising events, not for entertainment, but for infrastructure, digging wells, installing solar panels, and building schools. A quiet revolution was taking shape, one built, not on ideology, but on necessity and pride. International observers were quick to label it dangerous populism. Editorials in global newspapers claimed Burkina Faso was sliding into self-isolation, but to the people living in these villages, it was liberation. Meanwhile, Captain Traoré continued to draw comparisons to revolutionary figures like Sankara. But unlike Sankara, who was betrayed from within, Traoré appeared to be building his power not by consolidating it among elites, but by distributing it to the people, and that, ironically, is what made him more threatening to foreign powers. The real fear in Western capitals was no longer just the military alliances or the geopolitical realignments. It was the people. A mobilized, self-determined population is harder to bribe, harder to divide, harder to conquer. Soon, whispers emerged from other parts of Africa. Grassroots movements in Guinea, Togo, even parts of Chad began invoking the Burkina model, a people-led push for sovereignty, dignity, and development, not dictated by global lenders or foreign NGOs, but by communities reclaiming their own agency. It was a model built on simplicity. It required no foreign consultants, no billion-dollar loans, no IMF programs, just tools, trust, and time. But such a model challenges a very profitable global system. And that's where the true danger lies. For if this vision continues to spread, if African countries realize they can stand without leaning on the West, it may not only change Burkina Faso, it could change the entire continent. And that, in the eyes of its enemies, is the most catastrophic outcome of all. Stay with us, because the fire that was lit in Ouagadougou is no longer a spark. It's becoming a wildfire. As the internal momentum within Burkina Faso surged, and neighboring allies like Mali and Niger deepened their cooperation, another front opened, one less visible but equally consequential: the war for narrative control. Following Captain Ibrahim Traoré's bold declarations and the people's uprising for sovereignty, a new battlefield emerged, not with bullets and boots but with information, disinformation, and perception. And at the center of this conflict was a small team of Burkinabe journalists and digital activists calling themselves Les Veilleurs, the Watchers. Operating out of makeshift studios, remote villages, and encrypted online platforms, these young men and women were not funded by NGOs or backed by corporate interests. They were volunteers, engineers, writers, tech-savvy students. Their mission to counter the flood of foreign narratives painting Burkina Faso as unstable, dangerous, or falling into chaos. For every international headline claiming that Traoré was a military strongman or anti-democratic populist, Les Veilleurs published footage of local rebuilding efforts, women-led agricultural initiatives, and testimonies from formerly terrorized villages now living in peace. They exposed foreign intelligence fingerprints behind social media smear campaigns. They traced online bots spreading fear and panic. They documented discrepancies between what international outlets claimed and what was truly happening on the ground. One of their members, a young digital strategist named Awa, said in a viral video, "We are not anti-West, we are anti-manipulation. If the world wants to know what's happening in Burkina Faso, they should ask Burkinabe, not distant think tanks or retired generals on TV panels." Her words struck a chord. Millions across Africa began tuning in to Les Veilleurs' live streams and reports. African diaspora groups began sharing their content, and soon their message extended beyond national pride. It became continental defiance. In response, global tech giants began to quietly flag their posts. Some accounts were shadow banned. Others were taken down. International organizations accused them of spreading state-backed propaganda, but the movement persisted. What began as a media resistance effort evolved into a full-fledged digital sovereignty campaign. Traoré's government responded by investing in local tech infrastructure, building data centers and training cyber specialists. They knew the next phase of modern warfare would be informational, and they were preparing. But more provocatively, Burkina Faso began pushing for an African Internet Charter, a framework to regulate digital content hosting, user data protection, and platform neutrality across African borders, free from Western influence. Mali and Niger voiced immediate support. Guinea and Chad signaled interest. The African Union, long silent, was suddenly forced to acknowledge the issue. And this is what truly alarmed powerful foreign lobbies. Because controlling the story has always been half the battle. If Africa starts to tell its own story, through its own platforms, on its own terms, then the days of justifying military bases, humanitarian interventions, and economic leashes through distorted narratives may come to an end. This, for Burkina Faso's enemies, is catastrophic, because in war, the side that controls the narrative often wins long before the first shot is fired. And today, thanks to voices like Awa's and Les Veilleurs, Burkina Faso isn't just fighting to survive, it is fighting to define itself. And that is a revolution far more powerful than any weapon.